Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our speaker attending from the other side of the sea. Welcome to this science seminar, which today it's dedicated to navigating value-laden judgments about new approach methodologies in regulatory toxicology. And a brief recap about the purpose of those science seminars. So ECHA has launched those science seminar targeting the scientific topic in the field of the human health or environment, which are relevant for the ECHA's mandates. So the idea is to discuss the science, but also the regulatory relevance of the presented result within our mandate. So now I will give the floor to my colleague Ulla Simanainen, which will introduce the topic as well as the speaker.
Thank you, Safia, and welcome from my side as well. As Safia mentioned, today's seminar is exploring values in science with particular focus on the value-laden judgments in evaluating new approach methodologies, NAMs. As we move away from animal testing, NAMs like in vitro, in silico, and omics-type technologies raise important questions like what is good enough evidence, how do we handle uncertainty, and how do our goals for protecting people and the environment shape our decisions? Addressing these questions means also recognizing the underlying values and assumptions that shape our judgment. We will hear today how could philosophical insights help us recognize these values, supporting in the future clearer and more transparent discussions around the NAMs. We are very pleased to have here today with us Professor Kevin Elliott. Kevin is a Red Cedar Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Michigan State University, and he is trained in history and philosophy of science. His research focuses on responsibly addressing the roles that ethical and social values play in scientific research, especially in policy-relevant areas of the environmental sciences. Kevin engages actively in interdisciplinary work, including committees for the US National Academy of Sciences and National Institutes of Health. He has written a wide variety of articles in both philosophical and scientific journals, and his books include A Tapestry of Values, An Introduction to Values in Science, and Values in Science. So with this, Kevin, I would like to give you the floor. You should be able to take control of the slides.
All right. Thank you so much. Let me proceed. All right, perfect. Well, thank you all so much for coming to this talk. I know it takes a little bit of sort of willingness to venture out into some topic areas that you might not normally be thinking about. And so I thought it might be helpful to start by just giving a sense of who I am. As Ulla so nicely mentioned, I am a philosopher focusing on the sciences. And when I talk to students about what philosophy is, in the United States, a lot of students coming to college don't even know what philosophy is. And I sometimes show them this painting by Jacques-Louis David of the death of Socrates. And of course, Socrates played such a crucial role in the West, launching the field of philosophy. But he really got the leaders of Athens irritated with him because he would go around asking all these difficult questions about, what is beauty? What is justice? What is goodness? And then pointing out that we actually didn't have as precise answers as we might have thought. And so I say philosophers basically ask these kinds of big questions about all sorts of disciplines and issues. And so in the sciences, we might ask questions like, well, what actually is a good scientific explanation? Or, what's the nature of a scientific theory or a model? What makes them good? How do they operate? We might explore notions like objectivity or trustworthiness and explore, what do we mean by these things? What makes science objective or trustworthy? And in my own work, I've really tended, as you can gather, to focus on questions about values and what roles they can play in science and what roles they should play in science. And so that's going to be informing what I talk about today. And so my main claim, in case you get bored and you'll have to leave, is that we can have more fruitful discussions about the use of NAMs in regulatory toxicology if we're a little bit more sensitive to the value-laden judgments that different scientists and different stakeholders may be handling differently. And so I'm going to start just by clarifying a little more what I mean by value-laden judgments. And then the core of the talk that I'm hoping is the most interesting and potentially useful that you could stick with you are these four important kinds of value-laden judgments that I think we can be on the lookout for. And then I'll say a little bit about how these judgments may inform or affect the trustworthiness of NAMs for different scientists and stakeholders. And then say a little bit moving forward about how we might try to address these judgments in a fruitful way. So that's where we're headed. I'm going to start just with a little more conceptual work on the nature of value-laden judgments. This next 6 or 7 minutes might be the most dry, conceptual, philosophical part of the talk. So hang with me, and we'll get to the fun, more concrete stuff in just a moment. So when I talk about values, we can mean a lot of different things by that. Different philosophers, different social scientists can define values in different ways. So I'm thinking about them in sort of a basic way as desirable end states, things that we would want to bring about. Or we could also think about it as our beliefs or attitudes in our heads about those end states that we want to bring about. So just some examples connected to our topic today. Obviously, animal welfare comes up all the time as a desirable end state. We would like animals to not be suffering. We obviously value public health. This is something that we'd like to bring about that's just central to what ECHA does. We also want societies that are experiencing economic development. We want to achieve sustainability. We'd like to have industrial and innovation, and then various kinds of efficiency. We'd rather not be wasting money. We'd rather not be wasting time. And then also what I might call more like cognitive values. We want theories or models or predictions that are accurate. We want our science to be credible. That's a desirable end state that we want. We'd like our science to be replicable. And, in a regulatory context, we also probably want techniques that are relatively easy to use or that may be standardizable or things like that. So we could also talk about these cognitive values as well as social or ethical values. And so I think that these are important to think about when we're considering NAMs, because I think most debates about developing and implementing them have these values somewhere in the background. It could be explicit. So we might be saying, look, we should be pursuing NAMs in the regulatory context because they can improve animal welfare, they can promote public health, they might also be economically more efficient depending on how they're used. But also, what I want to really highlight is that sometimes these values might be implicit. So suppose somebody said that there's not really enough evidence yet to replace, particular animal studies with NAMs. Well, this, at first glance seems to just be a claim about scientific evidence. But I would argue that it's also value laden because deciding how much evidence is enough involves weighing the relative importance of different values. How bad would it be to start using a particular NAM and then end up getting, results that aren't as good as we would have gotten with animal studies? So that's the kind of thing I want to point out in the talk, these claims that kind of mix together value considerations and scientific considerations. And so when I talk about these judgments as value laden, it may be helpful to just get a little more precise about what I mean. And so when I talk about a judgment, I'm talking about a choice or a decision or a conclusion, like this judgment I just mentioned, that there's not enough evidence to use a new approach methodology. And so then the question is, well, what does it mean to say that a judgment like this is value laden? And fortunately, there's been some philosophical work on this. I really like this paper by the philosopher Zena Ward on value-laden science. And in the paper, she actually distinguishes, like philosophers like to do, a bunch of different senses in which you could say that a choice or claim could be value laden. So I just want to go through these four senses that might be helpful to keep in mind. So she says we might say that a choice or claim is value laden because the values are motivating reasons for the choice. So, say you, as a scientist, say, I don't think there's enough evidence to use this new approach methodology because I'm concerned about public health and I fear that this isn't going to be protective enough from a public health perspective. Then it might be value laden in that motivating way. But it could also be the case, even if somebody isn't, explicitly motivated by values, it could just be that values provide good justifying reasons for a choice. You might not be thinking about public health, but actually that might be a relevant consideration that, say, people deliberating about NAMs should be thinking about and affecting their choices. Zena says that it could also be that values in some way upstream are causes for a choice or claim. So maybe somebody was motivated by values at some point, and that influenced how they set up particular institutions or approaches for doing the science or so on that ultimately downstream results in this judgment being made in a particular way. And then finally, I find it really helpful to also look at cases where scientists are making a choice or a claim and it has implications for our values. So, say scientists aren't thinking about public health or animal welfare or anything, they just think there's not enough evidence yet to use a particular new approach methodology. But by making that judgment, it has implications for animal welfare or public health or economic efficiency or so on. So just pointing out those implications, one could say that judgment, that choice is value laden. So what I want to do here, congratulations, you've survived the most philosophical part of this talk, actually. My goal is to point out some of these value-laden judgments that might not always be immediately obvious, but that could be affecting discussions about NAMs. And so these judgments typically involve cases where people are making decisions or drawing conclusions. The available evidence doesn't really settle the matter, but there are important ethical or social consequences of these choices. And so, what I want to do now is turn to four specific kinds of value laden judgments. And I'm hoping this is useful for you as you go forward and are watching deliberations and debates, that you can be looking at cases where these kinds of judgments could be underlying some of the discussion, but might not be entirely explicit. So, I want to turn first to standards of evidence. And here I want to draw on the work of this philosopher of science, Heather Douglas, who wrote this book, Science, Policy, and the Value-Free Ideal. And she argued in this book that whenever scientists are drawing conclusions, they're having to make value-laden judgments about how much evidence to demand based on what errors they think are most important to avoid. So if you really don't want to make, say, a false positive error, you might really demand a lot of evidence so that you don't end up drawing a conclusion and end up being wrong about it. But if you're not so worried about that kind of an error, you might lower your standards of evidence. So she says you might, this might affect how many studies you want to see before you're willing to say, okay, I'm convinced, I'm willing to draw this conclusion. Or what kinds of studies, are you willing to accept animal or in vitro studies, or do you actually want to see human studies before you're willing to accept a particular conclusion? Even statistical significance levels. Douglas would emphasize these don't just kind of drop down from on high as the correct statistical significance levels to use. As a scientific community, you have to decide, what are appropriate statistical significance levels given the context in which you're working. So, just to give an example of this outside the NAM space before I turn to NAMs, there's an example I really like to give of James Hansen, the influential climate scientist in the United States. This is a picture of him when he was asked to give testimony in 1988 for the United States Congress about climate change, or they were often using the term global warming at that point. And so he went in front of the Congress and said, global warming is already happening now. And so, this is a claim not just about what he predicted for the future, but he thought that you could already see the signal of global warming happening at that point. And other climate scientists weren't totally convinced. They might have accepted that it would be happening in the future, but they weren't sure you could already see the signal right then. And they were worried about Hansen telling Congress, giving this message. But Hansen replied in a way that really fits what Douglas was talking about. He said he considered what are the costs of making this claim and being wrong versus the costs of not making this claim yet. And he felt that, given the overall social consequences, there was enough evidence that it was appropriate for him to make this claim. Other scientists could disagree, but recognizing that these questions about what kinds of, mistakes are most important to avoid, how much evidence is needed to make a claim like this in that context can help to clarify the debate. And so if we turn to NAMs, well, I think we can see that if different stakeholders have different views about standards of evidence, about how much evidence is needed, say, to assess or validate or use a particular NAM, well, that can be a significant barrier to effective communication if it's not brought out. So, regulators, industry scientists, members of different NGOs or members of the public are likely to demand different standards of evidence because of the values that are most salient to them. And one example that I think you all might appreciate, this is from a report that came from a big Horizon 2020 project that it generated this report on socio-technical barriers to the uptake of NAMs. They have a quotation here in the report from a regulatory staff member, and they said, we obsess about making a type 2 error where you conclude that there is no effect of, say, a chemical when there actually is. And making a type 2 error at a national level has consequences that extend across the landscape. So for a regulator, they may be really concerned about these type 2 errors. And so when they are thinking about if there's enough evidence to use a NAM, they're very concerned about those errors and wanting to be sure that's not going to happen. Somebody else operating in a different context may not be quite so concerned about the same errors, and so they may be willing to adopt NAMs, perhaps with different kinds of evidence. Let me turn then to a second kind of value-laden judgment that I think is useful to be thinking about. And these are what philosophers will often call background assumptions. So here I want to draw from a philosopher, Helen Longino, who wrote this book, very influential, Science as Social Knowledge. You might find it entertaining that she wrote this book back in 1990, and we're all still excited about it. I know the sciences often move, a little quicker. We philosophers can still be very excited about something from 35 years ago. So she argues that data become evidence for particular conclusions only when they're accompanied by background assumptions. And she says these background assumptions can be subtly intertwined with values. And so just to give you a sense of what these background assumptions could look like, it could be assumptions about which instruments are reliable. So that affects, which data you take seriously. Or, what kinds of experiments are compelling or relevant in a particular context, or what confounding factors need to be controlled in order for you to think that the data you're looking at are actually relevant as evidence. It could involve, you're trying to explain a phenomenon and you have background assumptions about what a good explanation would look like, or just what kinds of inferences are reasonable from particular data. And so the thought would be that if different, people in a discussion or a deliberation have different background assumptions, they may be willing to draw different conclusions, even when they're looking at the same data. And so, an example here, just turning directly to NAMs, is if you have different groups who hold different background assumptions, they may be looking at the available evidence around NAMs and drawing different conclusions. And so, I think that you all can probably come up with better examples. You're much more sophisticated about the science. But my attempt to kind of get your thinking started is some folks might say, well, we have an adverse outcome pathway. And it's pretty linear, and this may provide a pretty good basis for inferring from some molecular initiating event to some adverse outcome. And others might say, whoa, that's a problematic assumption. That's way too simplistic to actually draw conclusions. So I found this paper from a few years ago that just illustrates this, where the top panel is showing a fairly straightforward linear adverse outcome pathway, and then the bottom panel is this much more complex picture with all sorts of feedback loops. And so again, depending on people's background assumptions about how complex an adverse outcome pathway is reasonable to employ and one can draw reasonable conclusions from, that could again affect people's deliberations and views about the acceptability of a particular NAM. Then I want to turn to a third value-laden judgment that might be helpful to keep in mind, and this has to do with the language or concepts that one is employing. And so here I'm going to draw from my own work. This book, Tapestry of Values, talks actually about all of these value-laden judgments at various points. But one of those that I point out is how choices about scientific language can be value-laden in important ways. So even just choosing terminology, an example I mentioned in the book, and that became especially relevant during the COVID pandemic, is the World Health Organization decided to try not to use terms that could stigmatize particular places. So rather than, say, talking about a Brazil variant of COVID or a South African variant, they switched to, the Greek letters. So again, that's a case where these choices about terminology could have social or ethical consequences. But even choosing conceptual categories, like choosing to use, say, racial categories versus ancestry categories in genomic research, can be value laden. As I'm going to point out on the next slide, definitions can be value laden, I think, in important ways. And then even philosophers and social scientists have pointed out that an amazing amount of scientific terminology involves metaphors, talking about DNA coding or information or, competition in ecology or things like that, sort of bridge social and scientific contexts and can have value-laden effects. So I just want to point out, I think that in the NAMS case, it's fruitful for us to even think about our definitions and how that could be affecting discussions. So my understanding is that, back in 2016, ECHA was involved in a workshop that helped to sort of solidify how one might define NAMs. And I think that the outcome was to define NAMs in terms of in silico, in chemico, and in vitro approaches. And that may be a very fruitful definition, but others might raise questions about, well, what are the implications of a definition like this? Somebody might ask, well, does a new approach methodology have to exclude animals altogether? Could you include tests with very simple animals or animal embryos? And this really sort of became clear to me when I was looking at this ToxPoint piece by Robin Tanguay that came out last year, where Robin argued in the conclusion that it might be helpful to be including zebrafish embryos as a crucial bridge between, cellular models and higher order mammalian systems. So depending on how we define NAMs, that could either include something like this or exclude it, which could have significant implications for funding and implications for practice. So that would be an example of thinking about how even a choice like a definition could have value-laden effects. And then finally, the last judgment that I think could be fruitful for us to think about is how we frame a problem. And here I want to draw on this philosopher Hugh Lacey, who wrote this book, Is Science Value Free? And he argued that, when we face a complex problem, choosing how to frame it, what kinds of questions we ask about it, what kinds of solutions we accept as good solutions, these are value-laden judgments. And so, like I just said, it could involve, what we think are the most important questions to ask. And this might not be explicit, the framing we have in the background of our discussions, or what disciplinary perspectives we think are most relevant for approaching a particular problem. And it could, as I said, also involve, what we think counts as an appropriate solution for a particular problem or situation. So Lacey really liked to talk about agriculture. This was really central to him. And he thought that often when researchers are working on agriculture, they're influenced by large scale questions that would be framing their approaches. And he thought that a lot of agricultural research is largely based on this kind of question of how we can develop crops that have the greatest output. But he did a lot of work in the context of Brazil, actually, and as he was looking at the situation of small scale, smallholder farmers in Brazil, he thought that they might actually benefit more from this question that's in an international assessment for agricultural science and technology. Um, so this question is, how can we use agriculture to reduce hunger and poverty, improve rural livelihoods, and promote sustainable development of various forms? And he pointed out that depending on which question is kind of in the background guiding one's work, it tends to serve different values. Lacey loved to say that the first question tended to serve the values of capital and the market and large scale, agricultural producers. Whereas for the small scale farmers that he was looking at, he thought that the second question could actually serve their values better and be more helpful in various ways for the kinds of things they were concerned about. But he would point out that we might not be recognizing that we're really privileging one question as opposed to the other. And that's kind of the crucial point he wanted to bring out. So if we turn then to NAMs, I think it's worth thinking about, are there cases where different stakeholders or scientists are approaching research on NAMs with different high level questions? So, perhaps industry and some NGOs might be really focused on replacing animal studies. Other NGOs might really say, well, our focus is more on how we could add to animal studies with NAMs and, make the regulatory system better, not just completely, removing these animal studies. Or perhaps regulators, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but you might be especially interested in whether particular NAMs are properly validated, whereas a lot of academic researchers might be much more interested in developing NAMs, and not quite so focused on the question of validating them. And this also comes out again in this report that I mentioned earlier, coming out from that Horizon 2020 project, where they say that a lack of funding and support and incentives, especially in the academic context, for validating methods was a potential barrier. So again, the kinds of questions that you might really want to see asked might not be so much of a priority for somebody operating in a different context. And then another point along these problem framing lines is different stakeholders might have really different ideas about what contexts are most important for developing or discussing NAMs. And this came up in a paper I was involved in a few years ago. This came out of a National Academy of Sciences a workshop in the US, looking at new toxicology tools. And we had a table there. Don't worry about all the nitty gritty in this table, but I would just point out the column on the left that talks about different decision contexts. We pointed out that there are different problems in these different decision contexts, different approaches that could be useful, and different barriers to implementing new approach methodologies in these contexts. And so I think it's helpful to think about the different contexts that different stakeholders might be most focused on or might be implicitly thinking about, and recognizing that there could be other contexts in which we might draw different conclusions about the effectiveness or appropriateness of using NAMs, or we might want to be encouraging research on different contexts than we might initially be thinking about. Okay, so just to bring a close to this chunk of the talk, what I'm suggesting here is that we might be able to navigate discussions about NAMs more effectively and responsibly if we're recognizing some of these underlying judgments that could be at play, and recognizing that these have a value-laden character. At the very least, depending on how one handles these judgments, they can have these social or ethical consequences. And people might be motivated by values in terms of how they make them, and values might be appropriate to how they're made. So I've tried to emphasize the standards of evidence, background assumptions, views about our language and our concepts, the categories we use, how we define our terms, and how we frame the overall problem of thinking about NAMs. And so then what I'd like to do in the latter part of the talk is turn to the implications of these judgments for trust among stakeholders and how this could affect trust between different groups. So that's where I'm headed now. And I want to, there's of course so much literature that one could look at on trust, lots of social scientific literature. I want to focus on just the concept of what might make some scientific work worthy of somebody's trust. And because science involves these value-laden judgments, philosophers of science have been thinking about, well, what are the implications of this for making scientific work trustworthy? And a major suggestion they've made is that if one wants one's science to be trustworthy for particular stakeholders or users, well, then maybe one needs to handle these judgments in ways that fit or align with the values of those who will be using the science. So, again, back to the point that you as regulators might be really worried about, not, having false negative errors. If somebody else is doing science and they don't have that same value, they may not be assessing, work in a way that would be helpful for you. Um, and so this is a point made nicely in this paper by Torsten Wilholt. So he points out in this paper that when scientists are doing their work, and he's thinking to some extent about toxicology, scientists, they're making methodological decisions throughout their research projects that could influence the overall likelihood of, say, a false positive or a false negative error, depending on what animals they're using, depending on what feed they use, or how long the study goes, or how they approach the data analysis or the interpretation, and so on. And so he basically brings out this point that for this some result that comes out of some study to be worthy of your trust, you need to have confidence that that investigator has somewhat similar values about how to balance those potential errors. Or you could reasonably think, maybe the investigator is a perfectly decent scientist. They're not committing fraud or, anything like that. But if they're making subtle choices in ways that are kind of different than you would have made because of different concerns about errors, it may not be entirely trustworthy for you. And so this really comes out in a paper that kind of builds on Wilholt's work. These two philosophers, Ertzig and Kurtulmus, they actually distinguish two notions of what could make for warranted trust in science. So first, they say you could just have basic trust. You could just say, okay, I trust that the scientist who did this work was honest. They followed essential standards of good science. Like I just said, they weren't fabricating their results. They were following basic, good experimental procedures. They reported their results accurately. But then, building on Wilholt, they say there could be an enhanced notion of trust where you have confidence that these scientists are also handling value-laden choices, like about standards of evidence, or maybe interpretation in terms of their background assumptions, similar to the way that you would. And I think it's kind of fun. They provide an example just to bring this home in a concrete way. They say, suppose that you're a professor and you have two graduate teaching assistants. And these teaching assistants are proctoring exams in different classrooms, and they both report to you that they've caught a student cheating. Well, suppose that you have particular values. You don't want to falsely charge a student with cheating. You're really concerned about that kind of error. And you know that the first teaching assistant has the same kind of concern, whereas the second teaching assistant has different kinds of values. They really don't want to let a student get away with cheating. So again, you can see this comparison to being more worried about a false positive or a false negative error. And so they say, if both teaching assistants are honest and competent, you can have basic trust in both. Neither of them is lying to you. They're both looking at the data and not being confused. But they say you can have a kind of enhanced trust in the first because you know that as they kind of weigh subtle, complicated, aspects of the situation, they're likely to interpret things subtly in the same way that you would because of your similar values. So I find this really helpful in thinking about scientific disputes because then we can maybe understand why different stakeholders might not fully trust or have what you might call enhanced trust in research results provided by others, including results involving NAMs. It doesn't necessarily mean that one thinks the other person is, a bad scientist or, lying or something like that. But one recognizes that subtle aspects of their methodological choices or their background assumptions or the kind of evidence they're demanding in order to draw a conclusion are probably informed by their differing values. And this could be conscious, but it could also be subconscious. This is a point that I made in a recent paper, and that, of course, psychologists have really emphasized that we all, when we're making judgments, trying to draw conclusions from evidence, many of the influences on our judgment are likely to be subconscious. So even if we're not consciously, making choices because we want to promote particular values, it's probably affecting the way we're approaching our data interpretation and perhaps our methodology and so on. Okay, so with that in mind, let me turn to the final part of the talk. How might we respond to this if there are these value-laden judgments that permeate scientific practice, and we're probably influenced by these judgments? Our judgments are influenced by our values, perhaps consciously, perhaps subconsciously. How do we handle this situation in a productive way? Well, I think there are a lot of different strategies we could pursue. I, as a philosopher, particularly think of two particular strategies, but others could be helpful as well. I want to talk just a little bit about transparency and deliberation. And I think that transparency can be helpful as a way of bringing value-laden judgments to light so that we recognize that these are being made. And then deliberation can be helpful, partly also for bringing these value judgments to light, but also then for assessing them, thinking about their strengths and weaknesses, having more fruitful conversations about them. So in the last part of the talk, I'll just say a little bit about each of these strategies. So first, when it comes to transparency, I don't know if you'll be similar to the other scientific audiences I've talked with, but typically scientists say, yes, transparency is a crucial way to respond to these value-laden judgments. And I agree, but I think it's really important to recognize how complicated transparency is as a concept. So, scientists could be transparent about a lot of different things. One could say, well, we need transparency about like conflicts of interest or maybe ideally about people's values so we can better understand where they're coming from. We could also be talking about transparency with like methods or data or computer code or materials. So saying, well, we would like to have more access to all the data underlying, say, studies or clear understanding of the methods that were used. Um, you know, Thinking about Longino's work on background assumptions, we might say it would be helpful to have more transparency about the background assumptions that could have influenced how somebody, performed some analysis or interpreted the data. We could also be thinking about transparency, not so much for scientific colleagues, but for the broader public or policymakers. So we might say, well, Real transparency involves good explanations for non-specialists of what's going on with the science so they can better understand. So, as I was thinking a few years ago about these different notions of transparency, I developed this figure to try to help kind of clarify some of what's going on. And so I said, we could start by thinking about, what's our purpose for being transparent? And we could have different kinds of purposes, like I was just hinting, whether we're trying to help non-specialist members of the public or fellow scientists. And so, as I just noted, that kind of leads into our audience. Who is the audience given the goals that we have? And then what kind of content is most relevant to those audiences? I sometimes kind of joke that, my mother is a very sharp person, but she's not really going to benefit that much from getting access to a database with all the data from a toxicology study. The kind of content that she would benefit from is more of an explanation of like the crucial issues at stake in, say, debates among studies or debates about NAMs. And then we have to decide, well, what's our time frame for providing this information? Is it like before studies happen or during or after? Who do we think should be providing this information? And then we may want to inform all these aspects of transparency by thinking about the dangers, the fact that this can use a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort. Some forms of transparency could actually confuse people. And so we need to consider that as well. So I have a table in the paper. Please don't get too overwhelmed by this table. But I just point out that I have these 8 different dimensions here representing those different things in the figure. So I point out like we could have different purposes, we could have different audiences, different content. And the bullet points under each of these just point out all the variations we could have. There are a lot of different purposes or goals we could have in pursuing transparency. And so I think we need to ideally not just call for transparency, but think a little bit more about, well, why? What exactly is our goal? And who are we trying to be transparent for? And so, as I just noted, we need to think about those goals and then what that means for the audiences we're trying to reach, the content we want to make available, and so on when we call for transparency about NAMs. And perhaps much of the time, our goal is to help fellow scientists, to facilitate high quality science. Um, and in that case, maybe we're really concerned about making underlying data and methods available. So then you can say, recognize, oh, well, given these methods, I actually think that these investigators had particular background assumptions in mind or particular standards of evidence that they were working from. In other cases, though, our goal might be to help non-specialist policymakers or members of the public make good decisions about NAMs. And then we might actually need to call for more transparency about like big picture assumptions or trade-offs or conflicts of interest so they can just have a better sense of the overall nature of the debate. And so if you want to read more about this, David Resnick and I discussed this in this paper where there we were talking about open science as a form of transparency and saying we often focus our open science initiatives in ways that can benefit other scientists, which is great. But we also want to think about how our open science practices can be helpful to broader society, especially in these kinds of policy relevant issues. So turning to my last point, I want to say a few things about deliberation. And here I'm inspired again by Helen Longino. She grappled with this question of if scientists have these value-laden background assumptions that are influencing them, often they may not recognize that what background assumptions are influencing them. They're almost invisible. They just seem obvious. And so she asked this question of, well, how can we become more aware of these? And we might consider how can we become aware of any of these value-laden judgments? And she suggested that we need transformative criticism of our scientific work from diverse perspectives. Because if you have people who have different background assumptions who come to the science, then they're more likely to recognize yours and help you think them through. And so she suggested 4 kind of conditions for effective transformative criticism that she thought enhanced objectivity in science. So one was to have recognized venues for criticism. I mean, this could be as simple as just, the whole peer review system for publication or conferences where we have opportunities for question and answer. But we could also deliberately design deliberative settings for thinking through NAMs that have appropriate opportunities for criticism. And then there needs to be uptake of criticism. She says it doesn't work if you have people challenging background assumptions or other judgments, and then nobody actually does anything with that criticism. She also said there need to be some sort of shared standards for evaluating the criticism, or people just end up talking past each other. And she said there also needs to be a kind of equality of intellectual authority, where we don't say, well, because of your discipline or your native language or where you're from or your gender, we're not going to take you as seriously. She did note in some of her later work that this equality of intellectual authority could be tempered in the sense that we could recognize maybe some people don't have quite as much expertise on a particular topic. And so we could give a little bit more respect to those who really, know a lot about the topic, but we don't want to be too quick to dismiss others who might have relevant perspectives, even though we don't think of them as immediate experts. And so, what I would note is, I think what Longino was talking about philosophically has a lot of similarities to some of the discussions in the risk assessment context about deliberation. I think about this book, it's often called the Orange Book from the US National Academy of Sciences back in the 1990s, where they said we should think about risk characterization as an analytic deliberative process where you have these precise analytic scientific methods, but you also need to constantly iterate with deliberation to consider, what analytic methods make sense? What are the strengths and weaknesses of these analytic methods? What can we actually conclude from them? And they define deliberation as a formal or informal process for communication and collective consideration of issues. And so I know it's probably not shocking, the thought that we need effective deliberation about NAMs. You probably didn't need a philosopher to come in and tell you that. But one thing that I would point out is that I think that we should be, trying to create effective venues for deliberation and then reflecting on what range of different perspectives we need to really facilitate effective transformative criticism, to bring out some of the different background assumptions that might be affecting, the overall framing of the problem or the standards of evidence we're using or so on. And so just as one simple example, you might have other good ideas, but we naturally tend to think, well, we need regulators, we need industry, we need NGOs. But this paper just came out last month. I saw it. And it points out that as we're thinking about new approach methodologies, we really shouldn't miss the opportunity to bring in perspectives from environmental justice communities that are dealing with a lot of pollution and thinking about how NAMs could serve them. So we may be implicitly thinking about using NAMs in a lot of other contexts, but by bringing in different voices, we may gain insights about other contexts in which NAMs could be useful and how they would want to use them, what kinds of studies, what kinds of standards of evidence would be most useful to them. So, just a final point before I conclude is that, I've been approaching this topic as a philosopher, obviously, with my kind of the way I frame the problem, of course, thinking about value-laden judgments. And obviously, there are a lot of other issues to consider. Just going back to that report that I've mentioned a couple times before, the Precision Tox Group, they have this table in the report where they note different themes of barriers that could affect the uptake of NAMs, views of regulatory science and the legislative framework, as we noted earlier, validation and standardization, the availability of expertise and resources, different regulatory objectives and social perceptions, and so on. And so I would just point out that we need to think about this whole range of issues. But I do think that the kinds of value-laden judgments I've focused on in this talk do intertwine with a lot of these different issues that have been pointed out by others. Okay, so just to conclude, my main claim that I hope you can take away from this talk is that as we engage in discussions about using NAMs and regulatory toxicology, maybe we can have more fruitful discussions if we keep in mind these value-laden judgments that different scientists and stakeholders could be handling differently. And I just encourage you to be on the lookout for these issues of what kinds of evidence people are demanding in order to use NAMs in particular contexts or draw particular conclusions, what background assumptions they may be bringing to the interpretation of the data, how they're defining key terms or concepts like the notion of NAMs itself. How they're implicitly framing the problem. So, what kinds of questions they are focusing on, even if they're not sort of recognizing how this reflects a particular framing of the problem. And I've tried to highlight, I hope it's also useful to think about how, we can perhaps have gaps in trust among stakeholders and not be, sort of thinking that these other stakeholders are terrible people who, are doing bad science or operating in bad faith. They may just be making value-laden judgments a little differently because of, even subconscious values. And so it may be okay that one doesn't have a kind of enhanced trust in what they're saying or how they're approaching the science because of these different values. And then suggesting that maybe we can move forward in productive ways through forms of transparency and deliberation. So thank you all so much for sticking with me through this, probably a different kind of talk than you usually have. I really appreciate your coming and attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was really, really interesting. We have enjoyed your talk and your responses to the questions we had. I wish you
Thank
a
you
good
all.
day.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And feel free just to contact me by email if you want to do any follow-up. And I really appreciate the great discussion. You all are right on target.
Thank you, yes. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to contact you. I'm sure some colleagues will contact you with further questions. With that, I thank everyone for attending, and I wish you all a good rest of the day.